Leopold goes to put the car in reverse, and the car stalls. The car stalls right in front of
Wow,
Principe. And
jeez.
Principe is like, are you freaking kidding me? What are you
Fate
kidding
has
me?
handed me. Oh my God.
And Principe walks up, point blank, puts his foot on the floorboard, and just bam, kills Duchess Sophia. Bam, kills Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Hey, welcome back to another episode of WTF History. David Quintana here with my co-host Mike Gatto. Hey, Mike, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Well, you're looking awful fancy today. Why are
I
you?
dressed up for you, David. I dressed up for you. No, I just got off national television, so there's the
Okay.
time.
You could have said I was busy, but no, you
Well,
said
how else do I explain my
attire,
splendor, my sartorial splendor?
your natty attire.
Yes, my
Um,
natty attire.
well, this is going to have to level up your presentation now if you're telling it in a suit, which is why
That
I
is
kind of
true.
dress down because less is expected of me.
Less
Uh,
expectations.
yeah. Um, so today I think we're going to do World War One. Is that
We're
right?
going to do World War One. Two
Uh,
fascinating things about World War One.
so before we get into World War One, I do want to say this. I think what Mike and I are doing here is we're talking about a couple of what the episodes within all of that. So don't come at us with, well, actually, it was the blah, 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 the prince of, whatever. It's like, look, we're just talking about two little episodes within the grand scheme of World War One. I don't even know what Mike's going to talk about yet. World War One is so complex. The evolution and the beginnings of World War One. I don't want people to get lost in that. Just focus on what we're talking about. How's that,
Focus
Mike?
on the stories. Yeah, just listen to these stories. They are fascinating, and we
Mhm.
hope they make you just blow your
Mhm. Well, what do you got, man? Why don't you go first since you're wearing the suit?
mind. So, my World War One story actually starts after the war ends, but it's really fascinating, and it's a very, very, very sad story. So, the U.S. veterans who came back from World War One, they came back to a very tough existence. Many had what we would now recognize to be PTSD, but also uh, most of them had things like massive hearing loss, serious lung damage, and eye damage from being gassed. Because World War One, there was lots of use of chemical weapons, and several of them were missing limbs and had really serious physical disabilities. And this might come as a shock to people who are watching this, but there was no VA in 1919. It actually wasn't created until 1930. So veterans, and I mean combat veterans, were largely left on their own. So after these guys had come back, after our guys had come back for 5 years, the government said, gee, these guys have a lot of problems. Let's give them a bonus for their combat service. And in 1924, it passes Congress, but President Coolidge vetoes it. And he says, patriotism for hire is not true patriotism. And that's the first moment for people to realize what different times this was, that the president vetoed a bonus for disabled veterans who had come back from fighting overseas. Kind of strange, right? Anyway, Congress overrides his veto and the bonuses become law. And this was not a lot of money. We're talking roughly $1.25 for every day that they had been in combat. And this comes out to about $10,000 in inflation adjusted money today. However, Congress puts one important string on the bonuses. Congress says you cannot collect them, veterans, until 1945. That's when you will get your bonuses. 21 years later, after the fact, right? You fast forward to 1932. The Great Depression had been going on for 3 years.
You
For
know
three
what?
years.
You know what? I do know about this.
Oh,
So
you
this is
do. I thought
I
I
did
actually
this
had
is a
you.
good one. This is a
I thought
good
I
one.
actually had you. Okay,
No,
all
but
right.
Mike, how many people don't know about this? So I
This
think this is
this
awesome.
this story, folks, will blow your mind. I know
Yeah,
there's a lead up,
and it's
but
so
this story
forgotten.
will blow your mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
So 25% of men are out of work. 1 in 4 men do not have a job. Their families are suffering, and those unemployment numbers are higher for combat veterans. There's no precise estimates, but it could be almost close to half of these guys are out of work. You also have to understand that this is before the era of government safety nets, as we call them. There's no welfare, there's no social security, there's no unemployment, there's no disability, there's just nothing. So the veterans start to get an idea that sounds pretty sensible to us, having just come through the pandemic and, with today's values. But this was revolutionary back then. They say, hey, we're out of work. All these guys are out of work. The government owes them some money. Let's get it out to them so they can use it. Let's get it out as a stimulus to our economy so it can do some good. And with no social media, with no internet, most of these guys didn't even have telephones. It spreads like wildfire. This idea spreads like wildfire to every corner of the country. And all of these unemployed veterans with their families in tow decide to head to Washington, D.C. to try to persuade Congress to just give them their bonuses when they need them while their families are starving. Many of them have nowhere to go. They've been evicted from their places. They just want to talk to Congress. The newspapers started to call it the Bonus Expeditionary Force, which was a play on, of course, our World War I Expeditionary Force, but everybody just called it colloquially the Bonus Army. So these guys build a little city and they are desperate, but they keep discipline. They actually build the trains. They build the cities pretty well. And you now have a part of DC right by the Capitol where 17,000 combat veterans and their families, so 43,000 people total, are camping out. And Congress members, dressed like I am today, walk by these guys every day on their way to work, and many of them run past them, this ragtag group of guys who are hungry and desperate. Now, foreign headlines around the world, if you read them, they say that the US Capitol was occupied. And let's not forget what was happening around the world, right? I mean, David, you know this. In Nazi Germany, unemployed World War I veteran named Adolf Hitler had marched on Munich and he had marched on Berlin and he had tried to seize political power. So there's this sense of tension out there, right? But we have to remember these guys are peaceful and they were actually very organized and very polite. But by summertime, they were starving. So on June 15, the House narrowly passes a bill to give them their money and give them their bonuses for their service early. On June 17, it goes to the Senate, and the Senate rejects it overwhelmingly. President Hoover issues an order to the Army to drive them out of town. And here's a fascinating tidbit that was only declassified 60 years later. President Hoover passed his order to the Army and not the Marines because it was widely expected that the Marines would have sided with the bonus marchers and we would have had civil war. And that is fascinating. I didn't even know that until I did the research for this. So anyway, I want you to understand how strange this was. Hoover orders the Army, the current Army, to go up against the Army, guys who are in the Army just 10 years before. I mean, it's just so weird.
I know.
It's just bizarre, right?
Right.
So Hoover apparently gave instructions to keep it peaceful. He said, don't engage with them. Just try to keep it peaceful. Just kind of steer them out of town. But the officer in charge of the forces, he at some point just said, I'm going to deem this an insurrection and an attempt to overthrow the government. And he gave the order to charge. This part is so hard to fathom. The Army fixed bayonets and they charged the tents. The Army, the US Army, then gassed the veterans. 55 veterans were seriously injured. They were stabbed by bayonets. 2 were shot dead. Several pregnant wives of these guys miscarried from the exposure to the nerve gas. And a little boy who had run back into his tent to get his pet rabbit died. And here's the crazy thing. The US government, when they performed an autopsy, actually went to the newspapers and said, hey, this boy didn't die from the poison gas. He died from starvation. Like that was somehow better, right? And this was one of the darkest moments in US history. I mean, you really have to understand that the US government used chemical weapons on our own veterans.
And so many people have no idea that this even happened. It really is. It really is sinful that people don't realize that this happened.
As often happens in the world, the people who can show their superiors that they can do the dirty work that needs to get done, these are sadly often people who go far in life. The junior officers who led the current Army against the former Army, Douglas MacArthur, George Patton, and Dwight Eisenhower.
Just
I
amazing.
mean, folks, is it a coincidence that these
Yeah.
guys got promoted to the top 3 ranks in the decades to come? Now, how merciless were their actions? Okay. There was a soldier at the bonus march named Joseph Angelo. So specifically, Joseph Angelo had carried his commanding officer across a machine gun field of fire in no man's land, carried him to safety, then carried him back so that he could be treated by paramedics, saving his life. His junior officer who he had saved was George Patton. And which is crazy to imagine. These 2 men encountered each other when the current army was marching against
Oh
the
my God.
former army. And Angelo begged him, the guy who had saved his life, who Patton had called the bravest man to ever don the US uniform. And Joseph Angelo begged Patton not to do what he was doing to the veterans. And Patton did not desist. So what happened afterwards? Well, even though Hoover was largely innocent, aside from being merciless and clueless, and it turns out, Eisenhower was pretty innocent, the actions of MacArthur and Patton made Hoover deeply unpopular. He was already unpopular, but deeply unpopular. Shortly thereafter, after this march happened, it was nationwide news of what happened. Hoover took a train across the US as part of his reelection campaign. And when he left DC, there were people standing by his train as it passed by saying, "Don't vote for Hoover." When word of this stuff spread and the economic conditions and everything spread, by the time his train reached the middle of the country, places like Kansas and Colorado, the people on the side of the platform waiting for his train had signs that said, "Impeach Hoover." By the time he reached California, the signs that people were holding up said, "Hang Hoover." People were actively advocating to kill the president of the United States because these actions in the economy had been just so awful. And of course, Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, FDR, got elected in the election of November that year, a large degree based on the bonus army. And he took office the next year. The bonus army again went to him and asked for their money early. And the crazy thing, and again, this is just how different society was, is that Roosevelt also said no. He also said no. He vetoed the legislation that had passed both houses. And he just thought it was mob rule and unruly demands, right? But Roosevelt, I'll tell you this, was a master of symbolism. He sent Eleanor Roosevelt to meet with the guys, and he sent food to them. And one veteran said to a newspaper, "Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife." Big, big difference. And you guys are probably wondering what happened to these poor guys. What happened? And here's the answer. Roosevelt and the guys came up with compromise at some point. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps, sort of a play on the Marine Corps, Army Corps, right?
Put him to work.
Yeah, he put him to work. He said, "Any of you who want a job, you'll get a job." And 25,000 of them immediately applied on the first day. They just wanted their dignity back. They just wanted to come. Congress later overrode Roosevelt's veto of the bonus bill, and they got some of their money. They got some of their money a little bit early, but keep in mind, they had been unemployed for 4 years at this point, and their families had suffered immeasurably, including having some of them die. Folks, this was a very, very dark moment in U.S. history, and it should be one that makes all of us say, WTF.
Yeah. If you can think of a time when maybe social media could have been used to help avoid some of this stuff, right? I mean, if we would have had that type of immediacy of, what was happening then, hopefully, maybe that could have helped in a situation like that, to see the bayonets going into these poor veterans' tents. And again, Mike, we talk about things and what do they teach today? Because that should be taught, right? I mean, we should know about the bonus marches and the bonus babies and all that kind of stuff, right? We should know about that. But no one does, man. So that's a good story.
This is why we study history, right? This was less than 100 years ago, but culturally, what a different country. No VA, no sense of protection for them, very little sympathy from political officials. And it was almost because they were, holding their, Calvin Coolidge's comment on patriotism, FDR's comment on the unruly mob. They, I guess, thought that they were doing the best, but it's shocking by today's values.
Shocking. Yep. That's a good one.
You're going to talk us through the crazy origins of World War I.
Yeah.
Which this horrible mess, this horrible war, this horrible thing, it started on some crazy, crazy, crazy fluke.
Yeah,
Right?
and before I get started, like I'm literally standing here with one foot in one snake pit and one foot in another snake pit because I have not seen people flamed on YouTube or the internet like I've seen people flamed who try to delve into the Balkans. Like so please understand I will make errors. I will mispronounce. This is not a history of the Balkans. The Balkans is the backdrop. They are like a key reason for everything, but I'm not trying to get into who's right, who's wrong, and please give me a break here. And on World War I, as I said before, it is a plate of spaghetti. And who I forget who the author was who said Europe sleepwalked its way into World War One, but it's true because they had every possible exit door for a month to get out of it, and they just went because of egos and relationships. They went right into maybe what is the most brutal of all wars, where you had a mix of 19th century warfare with 20th century technology, and it was just
Which is a great point, by the way. A great
horrible
point
war.
that I've heard very few people make other than you. The history of warfare is a history of technology catching up with medicine. Medicine was still sort of, 18th century, 19th century,
Right.
but warfare
The
was
technology.
fully, tanks, machine guns. Awful, awful war.
So as we entered into 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was led by Franz Joseph, and he had lost his son. His son had, I believe, killed himself over a broken romance, and so the heir apparent was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is essentially just the Habsburgs, right? Kind of the Habsburgs trying to, still play the empire game as we enter into the 20th century. And they're having trouble holding on to everything because as we mentioned, technology had moved ahead, right? You got radios, you got, advanced, armory and weaponry. And so it's harder for these empires to hold it together because the resistance becomes more hardened and the message can be spread faster. And one of the areas that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was having a problem holding on to were the Balkans and what we call the Southern Slavs, right? Which are Bosnia, Serbia, a little bit of Macedonia. Okay, I know I'm going to get freaking flamed on this.
Oh my God. I gotta go.
Yeah, but please
don't forget Croatia, Slovenia,
right? All of these guys, right?
Montenegro,
Exactly,
yeah.
and all of them had great national pride. So even they had different visions. But I know the one thing they all agreed upon was that they didn't want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire anymore. And by the way, they had been under Ottoman rule until very recently, and they had drove the Ottomans out. And they were feeling good, right? And so now, Austro-Hungarian Empire is, kind of holding on to them. They're like, no, we need to drive you guys out too. So you have a lot of rebellion in the Balkans. And into this, and by the way, if people aren't familiar with it, if you look back in the early 20th century, you'll see what we now call like memes, but you'll see like little bombers holding a bomb, and they're showing up at places, and that was a real thing. That was a real thing. And there were like the Wobblies here in the United States. People don't realize how much shit was getting bombed in the early 20th century. I'm not joking. It's like how people forget about how many hijackings there were in the 70s.
Right.
People forget about how many bombings there were in the early 20th century throughout the world because, now guys had bombs. They could just throw them out there. So there was a young guy named Gavrilo Princip, and Gavrilo Princip was a Bosnian Serb, and he had tried to join, and he had tried to help them fight the Ottomans, right, for their freedom, but he was found to be too weak and too small to help. So around 1911, a little bit before that, he became radicalized. Yeah. So he becomes influenced by a lot of the Serbian and Bosnian radicals who are fighting the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He joined something called the Young Bosnia. And these guys are fighting to free Bosnia and unify under the South Slavs. So that's his deal. That's his entree, right, in 1911 into radicalization. So he gets other folks to join him, and they decide they want to get more active. And so they prove their mettle, as young radicals. And then finally, the Black Hand, which I think is one of the greatest names ever. The Black Hand was this secret society in Serbia with ties to the Serbian government, right? The government that the Austro-Hungarians, had blessed, but they had ties to it. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to also to kick out the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so they would create relationships with some of these radicals to help undermine the Austro-Hungarians.
The early mob organizations in the United States, that's what Italians called them, the Black Hand as well.
Did they? Oh.
Yep. Yep.
So the Black Hand, by the way, so there is a tie, because one of the Black Hand's mottos was, we want to be as the Piedmont was to Rome. So the Piedmont in Italy, right?
Sure.
So they wanted that to be the Balkans, as the Piedmont was to Rome. And in fact, one of their pieces of literature they called the Piedmont, because they wanted to replicate the Piedmont.
That is so random.
Which, if you think about it, kind of makes sense, because the Piedmont, like the Balkans are right there, right? They're right next door.
The other side. It's like Okay, I totally get it.
So that was one of their big deals, tying themselves, and of course, if you're thinking about, for branding purposes, you tie yourself to the great Romans, and, that totally makes sense, right?
Right.
So the Black Hand had reached out to some radicals, and they reached out to Gavrilo Princip and his buddies. And what they did was they got him, they tied him up with some other folk. But these guys weren't part of the Black Hand. That's very important to note. They were used by the Black Hand. They reached out to the young Bosnia folks and said, hey, here's what we want to do. We want to line up 6 or 7 of you along the Apelque, and we're going to give you bombs and guns. Jeez. And essentially, if you see the Archduke, kill him. So people have talked about, there was these great masterminds in this and stuff, right? And I don't think that was very mastermindy. Essentially, you find 6 to 7 gullible young guys, and you're like, hey, stand on the street. If you see this guy, kill him. What do we use? I don't know. Here's a bomb. I don't know. Here's a gun. So essentially, that was the...
And some of you are hopefully saying this is the way it is, time immemorial. You have the people pulling the strings for political power, using and abusing young men, impressionable young men, to do things like blow up a suicide vest or kill a head of state.
Yep. That's what happens. And so the Archduke had announced his route. He was going to parade through the city, and then he was going to go to the town hall in Sarajevo. He was going to give a speech. He was going to listen to speeches, and then he was going to leave. But he was going to do a grand parade, because you have to understand, nobility at this time, they didn't know what was going on. They assumed everyone loved them, and they treated them like nobles, right? They were the most.
And it's not the emperor has no clothes, right? It's that they had a series of staged, right? In any land that they ruled, the split was probably 70-30, loves them, hates them, whatever. But whenever they visited part of their realm, the local noble would just put forth the 30% that loved him, right? It was like, everybody's here to celebrate the wonderful king of blah, blah, blah.
So they had announced the parade route, because of course they would, even though there had been a series of bombings throughout that area in the Balkans against, folks like him, not at his level, but like him, right? So there was evidence out there that this was a very dangerous thing to do. And to show you that, there was a General Oscar Pachorik, and he was the general in charge of security, and he actually was in the Archduke's car. So at 10:15, during the parade route, Kabrinovich, who was one of Princip's teammates in this, he throws a grenade at the car. So they have a driver, Leopold Leuchka, and he sees it coming, and he moves the car. What it does is it bounces off the car, and it hits the car behind them and explodes. And people are seriously hurt and taken to the hospital.
Hey.
Archduke keeps going. So that was their attempt, right? The attempt through it, and they continue going on to town hall. So I think if you're our Princip, you're thinking, we blew it, right? We had our shot, hit the wrong car, whatever. But Princip decides to stay on the street. And this is important. Archduke Franz Ferdinand does his town hall stuff. And then he decides that, you know what? I think I'm going to go visit the people who were in the car behind me in the hospital. So he decides to go visit the folks in the hospital. They wanted to avoid the city center, so they were going to change their route. But no one told the driver Leopold, and no one told the drivers in front of Leopold. So here they go. They come back down the Appelquay. Who's standing there? Principe. Principe is still standing there on the street. Again, I don't know. He has nothing to do. They take the right in front of Principe because they're going to go like the way they thought they were going to go. And the general that I had mentioned who was in the car with the Archduke, he yells out, "No, wrong way." At that point, Leopold Leuchka, who's the driver, is like, "Oh, okay, we got to go the wrong way." And the general says, "We got to go back down Appelquay." Leopold goes to put the car in reverse, and the car stalls. The car stalls right in front of Principe. And Principe is like, "Are you freaking kidding me? What are you kidding me?"
Handed me. Oh my God.
And Principe walks up, point blank, puts his foot on the floorboard and just bam, kills Duchess Sophia, bam, kills Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The way Principe tells it is that he looked at the security and the security guys were just looking at him blinking. Like they didn't know what to do because who expected it? And that was the spark that lit the fuel-filled floor of Eastern Europe that became World War I. Now, did it actually cause World War I? No, but it was the first block that fell that led to all these other blocks that people were too stupid to exit from.
And remember, I mean, for viewers who aren't familiar, that at the time, all these countries in Europe had mutual aid pacts, mutual aggression pacts. And so it was like an attack on one, well, we've got to come to aid. And that, it really, I mean, this was more than the spark. I mean, I think this was a major catalyst, right?
Yeah, this was a major catalyst. Like, this is, in retrospect, seen as what started World War I. I guess what I was trying to say is that there was a whole bunch of stuff going on. There were a whole bunch of exit routes that Europe could have taken.
For sure.
But because of all of these centuries-old pacts and agreements and treaties, once Austria-Hungary declared war, then everything started to tumble.
And folks, I'm going to test my co-host's knowledge of World War I history a little tidbit, and hopefully you guys can do too. So, okay, so what was significant about the Tsar of Russia, the King of England, and the Kaiser of Germany?
They're all related.
First cousins, practically twins. These guys were all from the same family. They looked very, very, very similar. They were first cousins, folks, and they fought horrible wars against each other. Yeah, crazy stuff.
Just amazing. Hey, we want to thank all of you for joining us. You guys have really watched these shows. We really appreciate it. You're subscribing. We want to thank you very much. Get in the comments. Let us know. Please correct me, but don't flame me.
No, flame him. Tell him how much he screwed up the pronunciation of Balkan names.
Yeah. I'm a storyteller. I'm not a professor. But we love all you guys, and thank you so much for watching. Mike, thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, if you like what you hear, like and subscribe. It really means a lot, and we would love to have you coming back every week. Thank you.